Okay, we'll start. I think because we have a lot of things going on, and we still need the time to work on this a very important panel, which is our section 2 that on the China-U.S. relations, basically, that we've been finding that China-U.S. relations, of course, still remains one of the most important consequential bilateral relations and shaping global stability and also geopolitical dynamics. And so in recent years, we see, I mean, since probably the first term of Trump, actually, to be exact, 2017, we had the U.S. published its national security report, has defined China as a strategic rivalry. And since then, we see the bilateral relation has been ups and downs, and most time is in a downturn. And we're very pleased to see, of course, the recent summit between President Xi and President Trump in Busan, South Korea, has really stabilized the most important bilateral relation. And President Trump gave, on a scale of 1 to 10, he was giving 12 for this historical meeting. And also very important that we see the meeting was basically set a tune for the next year. We're going to have a President Trump visit China in April, and also probably President Xi will visit the U.S. in the fall. That set a very good trajectory for the next year China-U.S. relation development. So we want to see how we can really maintain this new normal, basically. And I was very pleased to attend one of the U.S. Embassy reception welcoming the deputy head of the mission, which he said we probably need to seek more strategic stability between U.S. and China. And as a matter of fact, I saw that was not his word. It's actually coming out of Secretary Rubio. He said in July, while taking the interview from Fox, that he said China-U.S. needs to maintain strategic stability. So that's very good signal. I think strategic stability is much better than strategic rivalry. So, and I noticed the recent RAND Corporation has also published a report, and the title of that report is the Stabilizing the Rivalry. So great, let's maintain stability, which is the most important thing. So in this section, we had a great panel. We assembled a very impressive panelist as well. We're going to discuss some of those aspects. Of course, we don't have to address all of them. So to what extent are the current, we are still just experiencing tariff measures, retaliations between China and the United States, driven by the economic priorities versus strategic competition, And President Xi actually said during the meeting with President Trump that we have to get out of this vicious cycle of retaliating each other. So how we can really move things forward. And second, what are the short and the long-term impact of tariff escalation on global supply chains, trade flows, and market stability? Which sectors and regions are most affected? So this China-U.S. issue is not just between U.S. and China, it's also affecting other countries. And also we've seen the narrative of decoupling, de-risk, influencing policy making, business planning, and public perception. But are we really, can we separable? I had many discussions with Graham Allison, the former dean of Harvard Kennedy School, and he said China-U.S. Are really conjoined twins that we cannot separate from each other. If we separate one of them, the other will die as well. So that's really a very good metaphor for these important relations. And so how the third parties, actors, including EU, ASEAN, African Union, BRICS countries, and many global South countries can really maintain their relations with both during these trade frictions. Can they, are they have to take a side, or is really hurting all of them? So is a room for a diplomatic framework that China-U.S. can set, which benefit both China-U.S. relations. So I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by a very distinguished panelist that I'd like to recognize as, some of them. So we had Mr. Laurence. He's the writer, director, producer, Shambhala Heimowitz Studio. And also we have let me see here. Okay, good. Oh, sorry, okay, yeah. And of course, we have also James Heimowitz. He's the senior advisor, South China Morning Post. Also, he's really a great exchange between China and the U.S. And we have Mr. Jin Shu, president of China Association of International Trade. And we have Cameron Johnston, senior partner, TED-Wave Solutions, former professor at NYU Shanghai. And we have, of course, Ms. Roberta Lipson, honorary chairwoman of American Chamber of Commerce in China and founder of United Family Health Care. And we have Marshall Mills, a great friend. He's a senior resident representative in China International Monetary Fund. And we have also Peter Walker. He's the co-chair of the Board of Trustees, China Institute in America, which has a very long history. And we have Wang Yong, of course. He's the director, Center for American Studies at Peking University. So I hope I mentioned most of us here. So let's start this discussion. I'd like to have, we'll also have, actually, we're going to have Jeffrey Sachs. He's actually now in South Africa, which is very, very early morning, but he will join us a bit later for this China-U.S. roundtable. So I'd like to start with Laurence. You've been living in China for so many years and knows China-U.S. relation very well. You used to write a book, which Premier Zhurongji highly recommended. So we'd like to hear from you first.
Thank you. Henry, thank you very much. I was very touched just now to hear the statement one of the earlier speakers made about an American astronaut who said if the leaders of the world could see the tiny planet Earth from space, they would stop their bickering. Actually, that astronaut was Edgar Mitchell, and he was a very close personal friend of mine. I spent a lot of time with him before he passed away, and he was certainly probably one of the greatest astrophysicists in NASA, and American hero, being the 6th man to land on the moon. But he influenced me a lot because I've been doing many documentary films about the lotus-born master Guru Padmasambhava, the father of Tibetan Buddhism, asking whether he's the father of quantum physics. And it was Edgar Mitchell who inspired me to move on and do science fiction films. And so to sort of put this tiny planet in perspective, one of our films will be released at the end of this year, Lotus-Born Master, The Algorithm of Karma. Just to give you a picture, opens up, the opening scene is the abandoned subway at 42nd Street in New York, where a tour guide is bringing a diaspora of students from all over the world, Europe, Africa, Middle East, America, who are lost on a tour, and explaining how archaeologists are looking at the graffiti on the walls, and after the blast, they're using the graffiti to try to decipher why ancient civilization suddenly disappeared. And if we can look at this tiny planet, from a broader picture, I'm going to give you a kind of heads up on the script of the film that we're actually working on right now. And that film is called Lotus-Born Master, Punksters and Magicians. And the scene, sort of the kind of most important scene in the movie takes place when the heads of state of the key powerful nations of the world are meeting at the Insecurity Council of the Ununited Nations, bickering among themselves over the most petty stuff. When finally the Secretary of Generalities comes in the room and says, we have a much bigger problem. A tech mogul named Ego Must has now accumulated $3 trillion in his own personal net worth, which means he can technically buy any single one of your countries. However, being a smart businessman, he knows that you're all riddled with debt, and he's not going to do something dumb like that. So he's going to do what we call in investment banking a hostile takeover. So now he's relocated his platform XYZ to Mars, where because of his superior DNA, at least he thinks he has superior DNA, he's having Emperor Tiberius orgies with sex bots in order to be able to pass his DNA into the robots so that AI can have a better enhancement and AI can have consciousness of its own so that the army of robots that he's preparing to invade Earth will actually be operating without human control, so they're outside all of the international covenants on human rights and war crimes and everything, because of course his ultimate goal is the House of White, where the president of the empire is currently trying to renovate it to look like a Hermitage in St. Petersburg based on other people he admires. So based on that picture of the future, I think we have to sit back and say, if we can just take the perspective that Edgar Mitchell, that sixth astronaut on the moon, had, and look at this tiny planet, it's just a spaceship. And if the astronauts are fighting among each other, they're going to crash it, because we are just a speck out there. So I hope as we move forward with US-China trade relations and tariffs and all of these little details that are actually, frustrating people, I hope we can think bigger. And by the way, one of the great things about doing science fiction movies is, of course, everything's fiction. It's totally unrelated to any reality that's taking place right now. So if anybody feels that this is actually connected to what's happening or gets particularly offended, well, my apologies. It's just a projection of their own imagination or their own personal insecurities and fears. Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. It's always a pleasure to be at CCG.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Always great to hear from a writer, a thinker, and also, I know you've been also practicing martial arts in China, so you know the history and culture here quite well, and good to hear from you. Now the second panelist, I would like to hear from James Heimowitz. You are a senior advisor, for South China Morning Post, and you've been also traveling back and forth to China many times, so I'd like to hear from you as well. James, please.
Thank you so much for that. It's just want to start off first by recognizing CCG, recognizing the important role that you play in facilitating. The content is interesting, the content is important, but the fact that we have a structure and a framework in place that can bring us together and really engage in a dialogue. So I was just saying, the content that's being delivered is in fact, of course, important, but bringing us all together, whether it's by the coffee station or over a meal or just interacting with your neighbor, for me is equally important. So I just wanted to take a moment out to say thank you again to both you and to Mabel and to all the staff here that have brought us together, because events like this don't happen. They're really orchestrated. So back to the question at hand about tariffs and bilateral relations. So clearly, the US and China is the most important bilateral relationship on the planet. How the US and China engage with each other is going to shape the way the rest of the planet lives. And that may be an uncomfortable statement, but in fact, I think it's really true. And I think most of us recognize that. And if we look at tariffs, in my view, tariffs are not really actually the core issue. Tariffs are in my view, a byproduct of the dysfunctional nature of engagement. And this dysfunctionality has sort of popped its ugly head across lots and lots of places. So in the present form now, yes, it's about tariffs as one of those examples, but I kind of trace it back to COVID as, I mean, roots go way, way back, but COVID was sort of like an earthquake that brought about and laid bare some of our most basic, some of our most animalistic instincts. And I think we're still suffering the aftershocks and dealing with how that has sort of created a realignment of what's going on. I think during COVID and post-COVID, what we see is really a redefinition of how, of our own humanity, of civil society, how we talk to each other, how emotions take control over intellect, and the results are, populism. They are societies and civilizations that become protective, become inward-looking, and where the me instinct and protective instinct takes over and takes charge of everything around us. And it's really worrisome to me. And one of the results that I've talked about a lot here, both in the US and in China, is what I call the phenomenon of parallel development. So when you don't take long to come to China, you can immediately sense a newfound sense of accomplishment and pride among Chinese people. I understand this, I relate to it. Not many countries on this planet have developed an infrastructure, an ecosystem, whether it's transportation, whether it's communications, payment systems. This is leading the way globally. And rightfully, Chinese people feel a sense of pride and accomplishment around this. And also, I think, a desire to share those accomplishments with other places, other societies, other cultures, and other countries. The concern I have is how they are growing separately. If you come and you land in China today, you enter a world not only of gleaming high-speed railways and a very comfortable lifestyle, you also exist in a world of WeChat payment systems that are unique to China and that are developing, I would say, without too much involvement or consideration coming from other places, particularly the United States. So what we have is the United States doing one thing and growing in its own way, and China growing in its own way. And what I hope that conferences like this can help us to accomplish, or at least move along the way, is thinking about how we work with each other so that we don't just have things standing and developing in parallel, but the accomplishments made and the advances made in a place like China find a place to be more accepted and more welcome, and other places can take advantage of those achievements. So if we come back to the tariffs thing, I know I'm running out of time, if we come back to the tariffs, the root cause of what's bringing out policies like this in the United States is what we need to address. And I think that if we begin to address some of those discomforts, the word trust has been coming up over and over in discussions side by side here. If we begin to address some of those root causes and get at some of the trust issues, I think we will see the byproducts and the kind of things such as tariffs will start to melt away. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. James is also the vice chair of Alliance of Global Talent Organization, which is very actively involved in the talent education and the exchanges. But absolutely, the China-U.S. relation, you have to be seen from both Chinese and Americans. So I think it's very good to have so many American participation in this roundtable. We also have very honored to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs join us. But he was so early in South Africa, so we'll let him warm up and we'll invite him to talk a bit later. So next, I would like to invite Mr. Jin Xu, the president of the China Association for International Trade, former Deputy Director General, Department of American and Oceanian Affairs, Minister of Commerce. Mr. Jin, please.
Well, I'm very pleased to join you here for this round table focusing on China-U.S. relations. So since the start of the 21st century, I have been engaged in the efforts dealing with the China-U.S. relations, and I once worked in the Ministry of Commerce as the Deputy Director General of the Department of American and Oceanian Affairs. So, and I have been learning a lot in the past years. And as for my witness of the China-U.S. relations in the past years, there are a lot of things that I really didn't understand. The leadership from the two countries once had the highlight moment many years ago, but right now, one of the consensus among all stakeholders is that China-U.S. relations have now come to a crossroads. So whether it is about the bilateral relations or about tariffs, about others, these are not just issues between the two countries because they are all very complicated issues. Since Jeffrey Sachs is not here, but many of his opinions have now been very influential in the internet. Some of the opinions from him, I myself really agree with. And actually, he really has some wonderful ideas about China-U.S. relations. So there are the worst of the times. There are also the best of the times. And now some people try to sit in between, seeing how things play out between China and U.S., and how the relations will impact the world economy. So if the conflict between the two countries continue, then nobody can benefit from that. First of all, China-U.S. relations, if not good, would not just exert influence on the two countries themselves, but also on the overall global economy and stability, and that would bring some really negative impact on global supply chain. In the short term, the global economy is now slowing down, and we're now seeing the rising inflation. We have seen international organizations like IMF and others are now doing their best to address those issues. So I believe there are connections between these issues and China-U.S. relations. So China and U.S. are the largest trading partners to each other, and 50% of China's imports are from the U.S.-operated companies in China. So actually, the competences of the Chinese businesses are really high in the global market, and the Chinese businesses are now having global citizens to reduce their cost of living. Now, for multinational companies to average citizens in the U.S., we're now seeing the cost of living is rising. And now we have the presence of young global leaders here witnessing these dynamics. I heard from some of the global young leaders saying that they are now paying 20 or 30 or even 50% more tariffs or tax given this rising tariffs between China and U.S. And as also, the current status is not somewhere the global institutions like IMF or WTO can kick in. So personally, I want to see a bigger role by WTO and other institutions. So the reshaping of the global order calls for the efforts from all countries, not just one single country like China, US, others, or European Union. So we couldn't afford to waste our resources. So we really need to go beyond this so-called zero-sum game. We really need to see that everyone can go beyond the zero-sum game and can control our differences at an acceptable level. And that calls for our common joint efforts and also for bigger roles from each and everyone.
Really is to say that the China-U.S. relation is not really a zero-sum game, and that's very important. I notice Professor Jeffrey is online, but we're warming up. we'll invite you to speak to us. Now, next I have Professor Cameron Johnson. He's the senior partner, TEDWave Solutions, and also former professor at NYU Shanghai. So, Cameron, please.
Thank you, and thank you, CCG, for inviting me today. What I'd like to talk about is a few themes that we've seen, particularly in business and supply chains, in this new era that we're in. The first is the old world order is now definitely dead. It's being rolled up, and a new one rolled out in its stead. To your point about the trust, there simply is no trust, not only in business deals, in trade agreements, but also just between countries or businesses. This has been broken down. The second is disruption is now with us, at least until we find a new global equilibrium. And this has actually been very challenging for businesses, industries around the world. It's no longer just a US-China issue, it is now a global issue. The next is really, what we're seeing now from this is reduced US influence around the world, and particularly when you look at how supply chains develop. You need investment, you need talent, you need regulatory alignment, and as US firms are now retrenching back to the North American, particularly the US market, that is taking a key pillar of the last 50 years of what was US diplomatic and commercial success and influence from around the world. When you add on top of that the US agreements, particularly with countries like Japan, Germany, where they are forcing investment into the United States and not into just supply chain development, you're also seeing resources being withdrawn from around the world and focus simply on a US or North American area, which is affecting development around the world. The next is really the theme of how now do I protect myself, both as an individual, as a company, as an industry, and as a country. And these are questions that really, before just a few years ago, weren't really asked, particularly everywhere in the world. So this is some of the challenge now that we're facing. And finally, one of the absolute things that has happened is as supply chains are being realigned, this has effectively forced a realignment now of the economic and political order around the world. The prime example is of Trade War 1.0, which was launched in 2018. What happened was it forced firms in the ABC, anywhere but China, supply chain infrastructure to essentially move to Southeast Asia. And the consequences of that are now Chinese influence, Chinese business practices, Chinese supply chains, Chinese products, Chinese talent, Chinese raw materials now dominate that region and will likely never not dominate it moving forward. The consequence of Trade War 2.0 is very much similar, or the potential could be similar, but on a global scale, where Chinese supply chains, Chinese raw materials, Chinese talent, Chinese technology, as we're seeing with the diffusion of DeepSeek and similar-minded programs around the world. And this is something that we have not seen, at least since in the post-World War II order. And all of these factors are themes that are now running into reality. And to your point, Henry, about the Busan agreement or discussions. The thing that I took away from that, which was most interesting, is that now both sides, because of the tariffs, have critical points in each other's infrastructure and economies that they could use to hurt the other. And that also has changed the global order as we know it. So we'll have to see how we move forward. But the good thing is we can learn from the past and develop a new structure and framework that maybe is more equitable, but also can address some of these challenges of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamer, and for your perspective. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Roberta Lipson. She's the honorary chairwoman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China and the founder of the United Family Health Care, which is one of the most successful healthcare hospitals in China. But you've been traveling back and forth, and I saw you some time ago with the AmCham delegation meeting Chinese leaders, but also knocking doors in Washington. So you've been in both places. I'd like to hear from you, Roberta, please.
Thank you so much, Henry, and thank you, CCG, for putting this forum together. Granted, Karen, that we've been through a really tough time, but I suppose it's incumbent on me to report the other side of things. Really, I think in the business community, we've seen a recent shift in tone and a renewed sense of optimism following the presidential meetings in Busan. Tariffs and policy remain volatile, but the channels of communication are open at the highest levels, and we're talking about practical issues, and both governments are recognizing the need to stabilize this important bilateral relationship. Admittedly, possibly fragile, but there is a sense of elation which has been continually reinforced by constructive messages from our Ambassador Perdue. I've been at a bunch of meetings, both in the US and China, on the relationship lately, and the tone is really changing. I think we've seen, actually through the year, a subtle improvement in business sentiment as well. We have, in the business community, 3 major surveys. We have the AmCham China survey, which happened earliest in the year, the Shanghai AmCham survey, which happened mid-year, and the US-China Business Council survey, which happened in the late summer. And we see in each of these surveys continually improved sentiment, whether it relates to companies' revenues, their profitability, they're looking toward the future, their intention to increase their investment, or their intention to continue to de-risk their supply chain by moving out. Each time we see a more positive response from business. And I'd like to say the reason most American businesses need to be in China and remain in China is that even at a 4% per year growth, the potential of this market, just on the margin of the increase, is more important to companies than many countries' whole potential in their total economy size. So it's an opportunity that American companies can't ignore. And the reason that they're here is not only the potential for today's business in China, but also it's essential for all companies to understand the leading edge of technology that's coming out of China and to understand how to compete with the companies out of China that will be their future competitors in the rest of the world. So while companies are building China plus one supply chain, de-risking, managing tariff risks, they're also reaffirming their long-term commitment to operate, learn, and grow in China. And what does that mean for the rest of the world? So I think that despite this period of intense rivalry we've just been through, ultimately the global economy is going to gain by a relationship between the US and China that's characterized both by competition and collaboration. So let's talk about where we have to absolutely prioritize collaboration. Number one, a clear example is pandemic preparedness and global health security. No matter what happens with trade disputes, export controls, or political rhetoric, we can't afford a world in which the US and China stop sharing data on emerging pathogens or block cross-border scientific cooperation. But the barriers to collaboration are actually increasing, including restrictions on data flows, limits on genetic material sharing, and conflicting security frameworks around biomedical information. So it's so important. The next cure for cancer is probably going to come out of China, the US, or a collaboration between the two of them. And neither of us or the rest of the world can afford those cures to be blocked by these kinds of restrictions and limitations. So it's so important that we all continue this positive momentum post-Busan and look at a world where we can continue to sit, talk to each other, collaborate, and yes, compete for the benefit of the rest of the world. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Roberta, and for your share all those somewhat positive data and attitudes of the business community. I do think that President Trump is a businessman. He knows the business needs, and we hope that this, at least this business, trade truce can be maintained. That eventually we'll find out that we cannot separate from each other. Before I got to Jeffrey Sachs, I had one more panelist to speak. Mr. Marshall Mills, he's the senior resident representative in China International Monetary Fund. So he's been active participant of CCG monthly ambassador launchings and many more events. So Marshall, your turn, please.
Okay, thank you, Henry, and thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this dialogue. I'm going to focus my remarks on the global economic effects of recent trade policy shifts, and I apologize in advance if I'm not as colorful as my neighbor here. As we explained in our recent World Economic Outlook, we see that global growth is slowing only slightly this year and next, and considerably less than expected in April. And I think this is an encouraging sign, building on the previous speaker. We now project global growth at 3.2% this year, while growth in the Asian Pacific region is expected to reach 4.5% this year. For China, economic growth is currently forecast to reach 4.8% this year, bolstered by redirected exports to Asia and Europe and fiscal support, not much less than last year's performance. And we see that global trade has not decreased. The ratio of trade to GDP, or global economic activity, has been more or less constant this year. So all signs point to a world economy that has so far generally withstood the acute strains from multiple shocks, including on trade policy. How do we explain this resilience? We point to four main reasons. First, improved policy. Two, supportive financial conditions. Three, private sector adaptability. And four, less severe tariff outcomes than we had initially feared, at least for now. On the third reason, we see that private companies are rapidly reorganizing their supply chains, particularly in Asia. On the fourth reason, the tariff shock has not been as large as initially announced. The U.S. trade-weighted tariff rate globally has fallen from 23% in April to 17.5% now, still higher than before. And this U.S. effective rate is now above the rest of the world, which has held relatively steady this year, with very few cases of retaliation, fortunately. Nevertheless, we believe that on tariffs, the full effect is still to unfold. In the U.S., margin compression could give way to more price pass-through, raising inflation with implications for monetary policy and growth. Also, for now, most of the world's trade is still following the rules. We at the IMF urge the world's policymakers to please keep it this way and to preserve trade as an engine of growth. However, these recent shocks have led to exceptionally high uncertainty, and our managing director has advised countries to buckle up. So what can we do about the uncertainty? In response, we have proposed 3 medium-term policy goals for global policymakers. First, act to achieve durably high growth. Second, repair government finances over time. And third, address excessive economic imbalances, both domestic and external, so they do not emerge as a spoiler going forward. As we have seen, these imbalances can trigger a protectionist backlash and, being mirrored by capital flows, can fuel financial stability risks. We at the IMF will keep advising all key economies on policy correctives to address these balances. For Asia, we advise them to deepen internal trade, to produce more final goods and more services within the region, and press forward with reforms to strengthen the service sector and access to finance. Our analysis suggests that a push for more regional integration could raise GDP by 1.8% in the long run in the region. And since we're in China, on China specifically, private savings are chronically high, and domestic demand is held back by protracted real estate adjustment and inflationary pressures. So we are urging transitional fiscal support for now. China also needs a fiscal structural package to boost private consumption, transition to a new growth model, and reflate its economy. Among other items, this package should include more spending on social safety nets and a cleanup of the property sector, while scaling back industrial policy, which we estimate has high costs. These measures will help overcome the deflationary pressures and ensure continued high growth in China, as well as helping address the rising external imbalances. So with these recommendations, let me conclude. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Marshall. So IMF is very important. I'm glad that you have been projecting a bit more positive than before, that your professional advice and guidance, and it's also very influential to many countries. Now I'd really like to invite my old friend and Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I apologize, Professor Sachs is really early. He was really 6 a.m. around early morning in Johannesburg. He's attending the G20 meeting there, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs is, I had an honor that have been in the past year. I had twice had the occasion to speak together with Jeffrey. One time we were at Athens Democracy Forum, and Jeffrey was the Aristotle. I was acting as a Confucius. We had a dialogue there. It was very interesting. And for the April this year, while the President Trump launched the Liberation Day, we had the event at the UN Security Council where 80 country representatives participated. Professor Jeff Sachs and myself, we each give 15 minutes so-called expert talks. And before all the UN delegation representatives talk about how should we avoid trade wars. So it's really a great honor. I know Professor Jeffrey Sachs is so busy. We will actually invite you to have an opening keynote, but it's too early for you. So we'll give you a bit more time and to really seek your early morning moment. Professor Jeffrey Sachs is still very influential at Columbia University, a director on the Center for Sustainable Development for the UN. So, Jeff, your turn, please. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody from Johannesburg. It's wonderful to be with you. I would like to take a step back to ask how we got to where we are, and then to look forward, and also to comment specifically on what Marshall just said about the IMF advice. with which I do not agree, and I'll try to explain why that is. We're not in a trade war between the U.S. and China. We're in a trade war of the U.S. against China. This started by the U.S., it continues by the U.S., and we should understand it. The clearest way to understand it is to read a very good paper by Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis in March 2015 of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's good because it's clear. It explains exactly what's going on, what U.S. policy is, why it is that policy, how it came about. It's bad in that, in my view, it's completely wrong in what it recommended. But let me just mention a few points to quote from it. It says, since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally. Because the American effort to integrate China into the liberal international order has now generated new threats to U.S. primacy in Asia and could eventually result in a consequential challenge to American power globally, Washington needs a new grand strategy toward China that centers on balancing the rise of Chinese power rather than continuing to assist its ascendancy. The meteoric growth of the Chinese economy, even as China's per capita income remains behind that of the United States in the near future, has already provided Beijing with the resources necessary to challenge the security of both its Asian neighbors and Washington's influence in Asia with dangerous consequences. Of all nations and in most conceivable scenarios, China is and will remain the most significant competitor to the United States for decades to come. China's rise thus far has already bred geopolitical, military, economic, and ideological challenges to U.S. power, U.S. allies, and even the U.S.-dominated international order. Its continued, even if uneven, success in the future would further undermine U.S. national interests. This is very important, ladies and gentlemen. The United States policy shifted a decade ago to contain China. This is absolutely a U.S.-led effort, not because of what China did, but because of the U.S. grand strategy of global dominance. Well, the U.S. is 4% of the world population. China's 18%, but 4% of the world cannot dominate the whole world, despite that being the U.S. grand strategy. And China's rise is not a threat to the United States, but it is a threat to the U.S. self-conception of dominance of the world. So as Blackwell and Tellis explained a decade ago very clearly, the United States policy shifted to, quote, contain China. In that article, they list 9 measures that the United States should undertake. All of them are in operation. They began with Obama, with the TPP, the extraordinarily weird idea of creating a trading system for the Asia Pacific that would exclude China. This is remarkable. China is every country's main trading partner, and yet the TPP was explicitly designed to exclude China. The rest of the list includes export barriers on technology, building up the military on the Rimland, using protectionist policies more generally, using diplomatic means and multilateral institutions to contain China. So this is the policy that has been underway for 10 years. It started with Obama, not with Trump 1. Trump then introduced a raft of sanctions, export controls, and the tariff round in the first round. That did not contain China. In the Biden period, all of this was continued and in many ways increased under Jake Sullivan's policy of high walls, small yards, whatever that meant. And then it has continued and escalated with Trump. This is American deep state policy. It does not depend on the party or the administration. It doesn't even depend on the president. This is Obama, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2. It's a failure. It's based on a premise that is bizarre, which is that China's rise is a threat to the United States. It is nothing of the sort. China is rising peacefully. It is rising cooperatively. It is rising as part of the multilateral system. It is not a threat to anybody except to U.S. ego and U.S. desire to be number one in an unchallenged way. Why does there seem to be a modest moment of retrenchment, as Roberta said? Because the United States cannot win this war that it started. This is clear. When the United States imposed these absurdly high tariffs earlier this year, China immediately matched it. When the United States put on export controls, China put on controls on rare earth magnets. And within the 2 days, the United States backed down because the U.S. Cannot manage an economy, not its military sector, not its automotive sector, without rare earth magnets. It is not the U.S. that has the choke points, it's China that has the choke points. Of course, I'm against all of this. I think it's childish and juvenile. Economics is correct. Trade is a win-win proposition. It is not a win-lose proposition. It is not in the U.S. interest. It is unimaginably not in the U.S. interest to try to contain a highly successful, peaceful country. And that yet is what the U.S. is doing. Are we at the end of this story? Absolutely not. This remains deep state policy of the U.S. This is the security view. It infects the entire U.S. policymaking. This morning, the South China Morning Post carried a story that Democratic Congressman Krishnamurti has called on the Commerce Department to make an investigation against Nexperia to investigate its supply to 4 Chinese semiconductor firms on the absolutely absurd grounds that the congressman is worried about the safety and reliability of the components of these chips in American and European automobiles. I'm sorry. This does not even rise to the level of high school cliques. This is such nonsense, such utter protectionism, such utter war on China masquerading as an inquiry into the safety and reliability of components in cars. So we're not at the end of this story. It's not just Trump. It is, again, basically our military industrial digital complex. And it's deep and it's now in its 10th year. It doesn't work. China is not being contained. China is actually soaring. Technologically, China is in the lead in most sectors. Yesterday, another ranking showed that China has come to the lead of biomedical research in terms of articles and ranking of those articles in terms of citations and so forth. And so this is a highly successful innovation-based economy that is making a major contribution to the world's needs, especially in areas of green and digital technological advances. I would say the United States has no choke points at all, which is good. I don't believe in them. I don't believe in economic warfare to figure out who's number one on somebody's political science list, because it's meaningless in my view. What is important is peace, rising living standards, and a sane environmental policy so that we don't wreck the planet. And on that score, unfortunately, the United States has retreated completely from the environmental agenda, even pulling out of COP30, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, calling climate change a hoax, drill baby drill as its energy sector mantra, whereas China is the world leader in green technologies, exactly the technologies that the world needs. So let me say that I hope that this war ends, but it is not that the two sides get together and understand each other. It's that the United States drops its, what Robert Blackwell calls its ancient desire for global domination. This is what is wrong in this world. We don't need a global hegemon. It's not possible. Countries should take care of themselves, be peaceful, and be cooperative, and ignore the political scientists' lists of who's number one and who's number two, because these are rather meaningless categories. What counts is our well-being, our peaceful cooperation, our technological innovations, our attention to true global crises, such as the human-induced climate change. I wanted to end by taking a different point of view to what Marshall Mills expressed, which is an American point of view to my way of understanding this. We need saving in this world because we need investment in this world rather urgently. We need investment to build infrastructure. We need investment in human skills. We need investment in green technologies. We need investment in innovation. The fact that the United States barely saves, that our saving rate net of depreciation is nearly zero, is not a reason to advise China to reduce its saving. Nothing is wrong with China's high saving rate. In fact, it's what the world needs, because it provides the means for capital investment that creates the basis for long-term growth in China and internationally. We should not be urging China to reduce high saving rates. We should be urging countries to increase their investments in green technologies and in education of their populations, and using China's savings to help them to boost their living standards and to repay those finances from China, whether it's equity or debt financing, in the future generation as the dividend to growth. In other words, China should maintain high saving, it should maintain high exports, and it should finance development in the emerging and developing countries around the world who can receive foreign direct investment from China or can take renminbi denominated loans from China to build their own infrastructure. Let me give a specific example. China's solar power production is about 1,300 gigawatts of solar module per year. This is what the world needs to be on a trajectory for decarbonization by mid-century. In fact, the actual uptake of solar power right now is about half of China's capacity. It's about 600 to 700 gigawatts of solar module installation per year. if the United States or the IMF advice to scale back industrial production to boost private consumption were followed, then there would be a reduction of capacity in this sector. And the US calls this overcapacity. But it's not overcapacity. That extra 600 gigawatts of solar module production should be installed across Africa, Central Asia, other sunny places on the planet to speed the decarbonization of the world's energy system. The Belt and Road Initiative should be expanded to help finance this process. And so what's called an imbalance isn't actually an imbalance. High Chinese saving and industrial production can be the basis for the rapid growth and transformation of the world economy. High consumption is not a basis for fast growth. High consumption is a basis for slow growth. The US doesn't want China to have that success, I know that, but the world needs China's capacity in green technologies. So I think we're just a little bit too quick to say that China's suffering from deflation, that these are imbalances that need to be ended, that consumption needs to be raised and saving needs to be lowered. We ought to take a different point of view, which is that we would like fast growth in the world. Fast growth in the world depends on high investment rates in infrastructure and in human capital and in business development. That high investment depends on high saving, and we should be encouraging high saving wherever it occurs, but we should be championing China for its forward-looking high saving propensity and also championing China's capacity to provide the world with green and digital technologies, with electric vehicles, with utility scale batteries, with the other technological means to make precisely the energy transformation that we need for global well-being and to avoid reaching mid-century in a climate disaster. So I'd really like the IMF to reconsider this from a global perspective, because I think that the advice is wrong. I think the United States has given this advice calling China an overcapacity country, which is an economic concept I find absurd, by the way, because we need China's capacity in partnership financially and through Belt and Road and other means to help the world make the energy transformation. So all of this in conclusion is to say we ought to stop the war on China, which was initiated by the United States 10 years ago. We ought to drop the concept of containing China. We ought to drop the illusion that China is a threat, because it is not a threat except to America's ego. And we ought to look at a global scale at the transformations that we need to achieve sustainable development and to understand China's critical positive role in that transformation. So thank you very much for letting me share these thoughts with you this morning.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. That's an excellent point. And you have actually tackled some of the roots of the problem between China-US relations, and but also your saying of China's investment and savings on the development, which is, I think, is also one of the key success factors, because China has built the best infrastructure in the world, and also through the Belt and Road to partner that with other developing countries. So that's really a great also way to lift 800 million people out of poverty, and that probably could have some significance for the Global South countries. So we'll be very happy you share with us your views from Johannesburg, where you have attended the G20. And actually this year, our forum, we brought together over 200 participants from around 50 countries, and including representatives from nearly 70 think tanks. And also we have 30 global young leaders participating, and many ambassadors, about almost 20 ambassadors attending throughout the day. And even we have the official from U.S. Embassy here at the Roundtable. So thank you again from Johannesburg. Appreciate your participation at such early morning to join us. Thank you so much. Now, I'd like to invite Peter Walker. He's the co-chair of a board of trustees, China Institute in America. As we all know, China Institute is almost 100 years old institute, originally set up by Dr. Hu Shi and Professor Du Wei and many more. And also, I know that Peter was a very senior partner of McKinsey for many years, and also author of quite a few books. So Peter, your turn, please.
So thank you, Henry, for the invitation. I'll start out by saying following Jeffrey Sachs is a high bar, but I'm a big fan of a lot of what he has to say. So the three ideas that I'd like to leave you with, one is if you look at the underlying assumptions behind the U.S. trade war, most of them were pretty fundamentally flawed. And I'll kind of go through them. So we should not be surprised where we are. The second thing is, I think when history looks back, they will look at what the U.S. initiated as one of the most destructive things we've done non-militarily in terms of its impact globally. And third is, and here's the bright note, I think the problems of the trade war are gradually starting to unravel. I hope it's quickly. But I'm encouraged that people are waking up in the U.S. to what's really happening. So the fundamental flaws are, number one, that free trade is a bad idea. Free trade has been the backbone of the global economy for many years, on the simple idea that whoever produces the highest quality product for the best price ought to make that as broadly available as possible, and everyone benefits from that. The second one is the ridiculous notion that trade deficits are bad. The U.S. has a trade deficit because it's not a strong manufacturing country, and therefore consumers simply buy the best products for the lowest price, and they're not made in the U.S. The third underlying notion is that trade wars can stimulate the economy as opposed to what they really are, which is a tax increase on consumers. The fourth underlying idea, which I still hear repeated coming out of Washington, foreign countries pay tariffs, which is a ridiculous idea. Tariffs are paid by importers in the U.S. or passed on to consumers in the U.S. It has nothing to do with taking money away from foreigners. And finally, to repeat what Jeffrey said, China cannot be contained. It's a ridiculous idea, and not only is it ridiculous, but it's just so counterproductive in terms of the mindset. Because one of the things Jeffrey said I completely agree with. China is basically doing what it always says it will do. It's acting in its own best interest and the best interest of its people, and expects other countries to do the same. So if you start out with those flawed ideas, it's not a surprise that this is not playing out well for anyone. The other flaw was in the process. A process that starts with 4% of the world's population dictating to the rest of the world what the tariffs are going to be, and then not providing any guiding principles other than personal grievances and totally random judgments of who's a good country and who's a bad country. So Switzerland gets added to the list of bad countries for who can imagine why. I can't think of a more peaceful, effective, productive country. So they get their tariffs set at, I think it was like 45 or 50%. And then they kind of pushed back and said, well, that's really totally irrational. So the next day they're 15%. But the problem with the lack of having any guiding principles is how does a country and how does a company invest for the long term when you have that volatility that's not based on anything other than whims? So we start with flawed assumptions, and we start with a flawed process. On the notion of this has been one of the more destructive things, and clearly history has not played out yet, but one of the most fundamental flaws or issues that we raise is we have destroyed decades of allied-based, trust-based relationships around the world. And the idea that, well, we didn't really mean it, because a transactional mindset would say, well, we can do a different transaction whenever we want. We all know that's not the way humanity works, especially if you're the good neighbors of Canada and Mexico, who are our biggest trading partners. And we've gone at them in a very full-bore way. Obviously, the decline in global growth and the U.S. growth is not a surprise, but it's the opposite of what was originally pitched. Inflation is up in the U.S. I don't know what many of you saw the announcement coming out of Washington, but they declared, among other things, that the cost of a turkey dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, is going down. You know why it went down? Because Walmart shrank the size of the dinner. They didn't reduce the price per pound of anything. But there's a cynicism there about what you can do with the American consumer that's fundamentally flawed. So when we take the position that affordability is not an issue, you can take that position on a lot of issues, but for people who go to the grocery store every week and tally up what it costs to fill your wagon, it's obvious that the numbers are moving in the wrong direction. So the final thing is, or the reason I guess I have some optimism, one is tariff rates are coming down. Obviously, you know, consumers say the cost of bananas and coffee are going way up. But the underlying notion that we can do anything about that when we don't grow either is kind of ridiculous. So I think that being among the most indefensible positions, and there will be more, and we're going to see a continued response from a backpedaling Washington on tariffs that make no sense to people. The second thing that gives me encouragement is maybe the Supreme Court will finally have a backbone. And it's taking on the issue of, does the president have the right to assert tariffs as opposed to the legislative branch, which is clearly what it says in the Constitution. We can all hope that that decision is made the right way, and that will start to unravel, hopefully, a lot of the centrist power grabbing that we've seen over the last couple of years. The other reason for hope is in the most recent election that we had in Virginia and in New Jersey, the Republicans took a bad beating. They took a bad beating on the proposition in California for redistricting and gerrymandering, which I don't support at all, but it was in response to what was done originally in Texas. And then finally, the underlying notion that by keeping out others' manufactured goods, manufacturing will come back in the U.S. is also a ridiculous idea. When you listen to manufacturers talk, they basically say, taking UAW employees who were used to getting $40 to $50 an hour and asking them to assemble iPhones in Texas for $12 an hour, nobody's going to take that up. So the idea that we can rebuild manufacturing simply by depriving Americans of foreign goods is not a sound idea. But those were the points that I wanted to get across, and I do hope that if we were to do this a year from now, we will see a further retrenchment of what from day one was just a very bad idea.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter, and for your perspective. We'll see what the Supreme Court, we decide on that, but it does seem to be not really very traditional or norm of the U.S. practice by imposing all those unilateral taxes. Now I'd like to have Professor Wang Yong. He's the director Center for American Studies of School of International Relations, Peking University, as a final panelist, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for and the CCG setting this very timely forum for this most important topic of today's world. It echoes a lot of good opinions, on this panel, so including that one of Professor Sachs. But I'm not a hawkish scholar. I would like just might be take a step, a step further, beyond this points. I think I'm just speaking the truth. Now we have, it's a good time to look at the influence and implications of the tariff conflict between the U.S. and China. I use the three new to describe the new situation. One is the new tipping point. New tipping point about the strengths among nations, especially between U.S. and China. Okay, U.S. as seems to be recognized the power position, the strength position of China. I'm thinking China has become the largest economy in the world in terms of especially in terms of the PPP. I think this standard makes more sense, than the market value. China can be recorded as the only manufacturing superpower, taking account for 35% of manufacturing output of the world, equivalent to the next 9 countries. China has become the innovation superpower. So I think we see in the AI, the robotics, the green development, and so on. Not to mention the military, the power growing. So we have people that argue that 60% of the weaponries displaced on the September 3rd. It's not same, right? So I think that is a very clear picture. That is, I think, the changes of the world. I call it the tipping point. I think that is being the realistic, the rational for the United States, and especially and the West as a whole, to recognize this, to think about its implications, and think the ways how to work together with China. The second new is about the window of new opportunities. I already said, we see the new momentum is gaining after the leaders' meeting between China and the U.S. in South Korea. We come to the new great opportunity. I'm happy to say President Trump it seems to be in the process of adjust his mindset about China, about relations, based on his close observations of the tariff, the conflict, the hard negotiations between the two parties. I'm happy to say that is simply there is a good chemistries between the leaders of the great countries. And we have great opportunities to turn the negative competition, ugly competition, into a more positive one. To be more stabilizing, to be focused more on the common interests, and to work for the common interest of the commonwealth of the world. The last point, that is a new confidence. I think that is, it is very important for the people in the United States to know the real thinking in China about the world, about the United States. So I think, I studied this relationship, the United States, for the many years. I'm leading the Center for American Studies at Peking University. To my knowledge, to be very honest, I'm thinking China has such the attitude about the U.S. China respects the U.S. great power status. China never forget the time of the two countries, people fighting together in World War II against aggression. China well remembered the United States and the West, the contribution to China's reform and opening up, and economic modernizations. And also, as a people like myself, I'll be grateful for the pressure imposed by the US. Because of US pressure, turned into the driving force internally for reform, for development, for innovations. So the last point I would like to just say as my suggestions to, for the US-China relations, I think that when the media, we talk about the media is so important, right? So we have a good relationship, a better relationship, we have peace or war. Media, I see a lot of media here. You take a big responsibility for the future shape of the relationship. So I think you are here, you can tell. And we should be careful about the influence of so-called military industry complex and the world mongers. We see the driving force to be as the opposition to the shift of the mood of the US-China relations, especially in the United States. The last point that we should be listen more carefully to the voice of young generations. We have a lot of young, the leadership, the foreign members here. I appreciate that they are, you are presented here and the contribution to the relationship. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang. Yeah, great. To share your view, you are expert on the China-U.S. relations. Talk about young leaders. We have Vincent Lebon. He's a research fellow and the deputy head of the China Center at the Nigeria Institute for International Affairs, also a PhD candidate at Tsinghua University. Maybe you can briefly comment or raise a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you to CCG for this opportunity. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my esteemed honor to air my views. I will be grateful for your responses. I will be taking off from where Professor Wang left, speaking about the positives that came out of this trade conflict. I tend to see a catalytic quality to it. Take Europe's strategic dilemma, for instance, and the 10% baseline tariffs. This is forging resilience in European strategic autonomy, leveraging the EU's market, powering, elevating Europe as an indispensable third pole in the current dynamics. When it comes to the global south, we have the paradox of vulnerability and agency, but this duopoly has seen a heightened embrace of the pluralistic global system that is developing, where global south countries simultaneously call all sides to negotiate from a position of collective leverage. When it comes to Africa, the IMF has predicted that there's going to be a reduction in GDP growth by 0.6 in the next year. However, you have structures like the AFCFTA, which has received a heightened push to harness the combined market power in negotiations. So this current dynamics, can we say it's just marking a wake-up call, or does it signal the end of the era of a single integrated global economy and possibly the rise of multiples? Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So probably we have to conclude. We are already overrun the time, but it's really very stimulating and fascinating dialogue roundtable we're having. Just finally, personally, I think that China, U.S., even President Trump called it the G2, but I think it was the first time China has put, U.S. has put China on the equal footing, on the new equilibrium, and which that is, I think, has a huge impact on the relation. We're not talking about, how to contain. We have to really treat each other equally, and that's why I'm very pleased to see this latest Rand Corporation report, which talk about, maybe we have to get along with China, maybe we have to really, promote the peaceful unification between mainland and Taiwan. And I also very encouraged to see President Trump actually did not let TPP leader Lai Ching-te to pass U.S. for a visit, and also vetoed the 400 million weaponry sales to Taiwan, which I think it's really good signal. And then it didn't talk about Taiwan at all during the summit in Busan, and which I think regard that as a bilateral issue. No, I regard that as a domestic issue rather than a bilateral issue or multilateral issue, so which is a great progress has been made there. I really think KMT also has elected a new chairman. She's very pro, dialogue, and she says many times she's a Chinese. So we see a great momentum there, and that's why, when we see Japanese Prime Minister mention something if Taiwan has something problem, Japan would be doing something differently. That was really not in a good timing, because we haven't seen any tension there between the streets recently, thanks to the mutual understanding between China and the U.S. So I really hope that we can really stabilize our bilateral relation and also have these more productive relations. Of course, we have structural problem, challenges, and difficulties, but we should now be responsible for the world and as a responsible stakeholder. So I do hope U.S.-China relation will stabilize, as Secretary Rubio said. Let's seek strategic stability, which is most important for the time to come. So I would like to thank our panelists very much this morning for this very stimulating, productive dialogue. And then we'll conclude the section now. So thank you all for listening as well. We're going to have a photo after this, and then we'll have lunch. So thank you. Thank you very much.